everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Shifty's 49ers Talk. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the 49ers 53-man roster, and there have just been some breaking news and some breaking updates, and I will be including that news in my 53-man roster discussion, breakdown, and analysis. Let's not waste any time, guys. We're jumping right in. So what we are going to do is we're going to start off on offense, and we're going to start off, of course, with the quarterback position. And this year, the Niners will have 3 quarterbacks on the 53-man roster. Trey Lance will be the starter. Jimmy Garoppolo will be the main backup. If you want my thoughts on that whole situation, I'm going to leave a link in the description to my video for that, which I talked about a couple of days ago. Quarterback number 3 is going to be Brock Purdy. Now, this was a bit of a shock. I think people expected him to get cut and maybe make the practice squad, but clearly the 49ers, A, they really like what they have in Brock Purdy, B, they really didn't think he'd make it to the practice squad, and C, I just think that they like Purdy as a potential long-term backup. So this year, 2022, I expect Jimmy Garoppolo to be on the roster, could potentially get traded should an opportunity present itself, but otherwise, I think we just keep Brock Purdy on the roster, develop him, and he could be a guy, as he progresses and develops in the NFL, could be an effective backup where if he needs to come in and play a couple of games here and there, that he won't be an absolute liability. Now, let's move on to the running back room. And this is where there was just some breaking news that kind of changed things a little bit. As of right now, the 49ers will have 5 running backs, and that's when you include fullback Kyle Juszczyk. So of course, Juszczyk, we know he was going to make the roster. The other 4 running backs, we're going to have Elijah Mitchell, who is our running back number 1, who is back to practice, will be full go for week 1 at Chicago. Then for some depth, we have Jeff Wilson Jr., we have this year's 3rd round pick, TDP, and then undrafted free agent Jordan Mason. Now, really, the big news here was with regards to Trey Sermon getting waived by the team, and I really hope that this is somewhat of a lesson that the 49ers learn. So we drafted Joe Williams in Shanahan and Lynch's first year in San Francisco. That did not work out at all. Last year, 2021, we drafted Trey Sermon in the 3rd round. Clearly, we just waived him, and it's, I think, unlikely that he makes our practice squad. So that's another big mistake. When you have like a pick, like a 3rd round pick, to be cut after 1 year, not ideal. So really, I hope they learn from that and move on. Overall, though, I really like the running back room. Elijah Mitchell's an absolute stud. We have really good depth in Jeff Wilson Jr. Jordan Mason is incredibly promising, and so is TDP. So I like this group of players. Let's now move on to the wide receivers and tight ends. So for the wide receivers, we're only keeping 5 guys. Of course, it's going to be Deebo, Aiyuk, and then after that, the 3 other players, Jauan, Jennings, Ray McCloud, and the rookie Danny Gray. Overall, I really like this group of players. There's a lot of, we kind of have a little bit of everything. I mean, we know Deebo can do it all. Aiyuk is a prototypical receiver. Then you have like the smaller, shiftier guy like Ray McCloud. Danny Gray is the absolute speedster, and then Jauan Jennings, bigger, more physical guy. So overall, it's a very well-rounded group and a very talented group, which I think is really going to help carry this team and really allow Trey Lance to just make plays not only down the field, but continue what we did with Jimmy Garoppolo, which is quick passes and allow guys to get yards after the catch. Now let's move on to the tight end group. And there's actually 4 guys we're keeping. I would have thought maybe 3, but we've decided to keep 4. So, of course, George Kittle, who needs no introduction. He is arguably the best tight end in football. After that, we have Ross Dwelley, who actually impressed me a little bit in preseason. It's something that we already knew, but it's just good to see with Ross Dwelley that he is incredibly versatile. He can line up in the backfield. So should anything happen to a Kyle Juszczyk, Ross Dwelley can fill that fullback role. So I really like what Ross Dwelley brings to us. Charlie Woerner, the more of like a blocking tight end. And then, of course, we have like the savvy veteran in Tyler Kroft. So overall, a really well-rounded group at tight end. You got a nice blend of like, youth and then veterans, and then just they each bring different skills. I would like to see, however, Charlie Woerner develop more as a receiver, as a pass catcher, just so he can be more of a threat in the passing game, especially when we try and hit defenses on play action. Let's now move to the offensive line, and there was another change just made today to this. So let's start off with our projected starting offensive line. So of course, Trent Williams Best left tackle in football is, of course, going to be our starting left tackle. Left guard, seemingly, is going to be Aaron Banks. At center, it's going to be Jake Brendel. Right guard is going to be Spencer Burford, the rookie. And then at right tackle should be Mike McGlinchey. Hopefully, he's healthy and ready to go. So we have that veteran, experienced guy out there starting week 1. Now let's move on to some of our depth at the offensive line. So the first guy I want to talk about is Daniel Brunskill. Similar to McGlinchey, I really do hope that he's healthy and ready to go, because Brunskill's true value is in his versatility. Should anyone get injured, Brunskill can essentially play all 5 positions on the offensive line, and he would ideally be the first man up should anyone go down with injury. After that, we have Colton McKivitz, who's our, basically our swing tackle, can play left or right tackle. Has been with the team for a couple of years, knows the scheme, knows the coaching. Then we have Nick Zakelj, the rookie, someone who I think the team projects long-term to maybe be a backup center. I think for right now can probably play a little bit of guard too. Ultimately, I do believe that Brunskill is the primary backup guy at center, though. We have Jaylon Moore, second-year player. He had a rough preseason, especially against the Houston Texans, so I don't think we'll see too much of Jaylon Moore, and no offense to Jaylon Moore, I just hope we don't see too much of him, because that means we're suffering injuries on the offensive line. Let's round off the offensive line with Blake Hance, who we claimed off of waivers from the Cleveland Browns. He started 10 games last year, 8 at right tackle, 2 at left tackle. He is someone where if McGlinchey's hurt, if Brunskill's hurt, and maybe we're not 100% sure on McKivitz, although in that situation, McKivitz would be the right tackle, but we do have depth there, and that's so important in this longer NFL season, which is 17 regular season games. Overall, the offense is looking really strong, especially on the offensive line if our guys stay healthy, stay consistent, and really start to gel and form that chemistry. This is going to be a powerful, hard-to-stop offense. Let's now move on to the defensive side of the ball, and we'll kick it off with the defensive line, where we kept 10 guys. There was a couple of surprise cuts, but we'll talk about that momentarily. So, of course, the starting defensive line, in my eyes, it's going to be Nick Bosa, Arik Armstead, Javon Kinlaw, and Samson Ebukam. Right behind those, we're going to have Charles Omenihu, we're going to have Hassan Ridgeway, we're going to have Kevin Givens, and then we're going to have Kerry Hyder Jr., along with rookie Drake Jackson, who's been looking phenomenal in preseason and in training camp. And then we rounded off with Jordan Willis, who was initially cut, but then brought back onto the 53-man roster. One of the surprises here was that defensive lineman, the edge player Kemoko Trey, was actually cut by the team, but he has since cleared waivers and no team has opted to sign him, so he is now moved to our practice squad, and I think that's a very valuable piece to have on the practice squad. I don't know how long he'll last there, just considering he is a talented player who's proven himself in the NFL as long as he stays healthy. Now, from there, let's now move on to the linebacking core, and this is probably the best linebacking core in the NFL, and I really don't think there's much of a question about that. Number 1, Fred Woerner, one of the best linebackers in the NFL. Then you have Dre Greenlaw, Azeez Al-Shaair, and then at depth you have Oren Burks, who is a special teams ace, but we saw him preseason played pretty darn well at linebacker. We rounded off with Demetrius Flanagan-Foles, another guy who can play some special teams, but has looked pretty darn good in preseason, so we have to feel good about the depth that we have at linebacker, just plus the overall talent is insane. Now, to me, one of the shockers here is the fact that at cornerback, we've only kept 5 guys. Of course, Charvarius Ward and Emmanuel Mosley will be the starters on the outside. In that nickelback spot, you have to assume it's going to be rookie Samuel Womack, who's just been phenomenal in the preseason and has also been making a bunch of plays in training camp. So that's going to be basically your starting defensive backs. Along with those guys, we're going to have second-year players Diamador Lenore and Ambry Thomas. Now, Ambry Thomas has seemingly fallen down the depth chart a little bit. To me, he's a guy where I think as the season goes along, he's a guy who gets better. And he has played in some big moments and played pretty well in big moments last year. So for depth purposes, I think he's a very solid player to have on the roster. Some notable cuts right here is probably Dante Johnson, but I think we all know he'll be back on the team at some point Probably sooner rather than later, but we'll see. Jason Verrett, he is going to be on the physically unable to perform list, so he will actually miss the first 4 games of the season. But man, getting him back midseason, if he can stay healthy, this just makes our cornerback room just maybe right up there with arguably some of the best in the NFL. Another relatively surprise cut was going to be Tariq Castro-Fields, the rookie 6th-round pick out of Penn State. We waived him, and he was claimed by the Washington Commanders. So I do wish Tariq Castro-Fields good luck in Washington, except when you play the 49ers. Now moving on to the safety position. Right now we just have Talanoa Hufanga, George Odom, and Charvarius Moore. Only 3 guys ready to go, and that's because Jimmy Ward placed on that short-term IR, so he will also miss the first 4 games. Now, just in a moment, we are going to look at some of the safeties that we have on the practice squad, and I really wouldn't be surprised prior to week 1 that we do make some roster moves where we actually get that 4th safety, because going into a game with only 3 safeties, that could spell trouble if there are any injuries, and of course, we'll always knock on wood, and hopefully there are not, but we're now going to move on to the practice squad. As of right now for the practice squad, we have 13 players signed to it. Overall, I believe you can have 16. So let's look at some of the guys. And there's actually some really talented players here, which is awesome to see and really shows the depth that the 49ers have. So initially on offense, for the wide receivers, we have Malik Turner. Malik Turner played pretty well in preseason, also has a ton of value on special teams. Then we have the longtime veteran Willie Snead Jr. We talked about him in a previous video, just someone who's been around, can play the position. Should we suffer some injuries, he can come in and do a good job. And finally, Tay Martin. That's someone else who we've had for a little while. He's been with the team through the offseason, so would be somewhat familiar with the scheme. Now let's move on to the offensive line. So the big name here was Jason Poe. So he's someone who's become a fan favorite, and for good reason, during the preseason, especially in the game against the Minnesota Vikings preseason week 2, and also in the game against the Houston Texans week 3. I thought Poe played pretty darn well. Doesn't have the prototypical size, but really just plays bigger than he actually is, and I wouldn't be shocked if he makes it onto the 53-man roster at some point this year. The other 2 guys we have on the offensive line, Keaton Sutherland, then we have Alfredo Gutierrez as well, both of those guys on the 49ers practice squad. I will be interested to see what happens with Donovan West. You know, he was someone who was maybe projected to be a 4th or 5th round pick. We got him as an undrafted free agent. He was with us for the offseason, so I'll be curious to see where he ends up, hopefully back with the 49ers. Now, when we move on to the defensive side of the ball, we also have some really talented players here on the defensive line. Kemoko Trey, I think he is someone who, like Jason Poe, could very well find himself on the active roster at some point during this season. We also have Akeem Spence. He's someone who I thought in the game against Houston made some really nice plays, someone who was really excelled against the run when initially we could not stop the Houston run game. So I like him. And then we also have Alex Barrett on the defensive line for the practice squad. Moving on to linebackers, just one guy here, Marcelino McCrary-Ball. He's someone who had an interception in preseason week 1 against the Packers. Overall, solid depth. He's been with the team for a little while. So if we do need to go to that depth, he's someone who can come in, play, and I think do an admirable job. Now, someone who I think a lot of people were really excited about, who ended up getting waived by the team, but we now have him on the practice squad. That's going to be cornerback Quantrez Knight out of UCLA, undrafted guy, someone who really did impress through preseason, again, and training camp. So, again, if that cornerback depth gets tested like it did last year, he is a guy who we could maybe see play some snaps, but ideally it doesn't get to the point where we have to start rookie undrafted free agent cornerbacks. So, and then to round off our practice squad so far, we have safeties Tashawn Gibson, who I talked about in a video as well when I was thinking that he's a potential candidate for us to sign, and we did sign him. And then also Taylor Hawkins, who had an interception, I believe it was against the Minnesota Vikings preseason week 2. So I think probably Gibson could be a guy who might be that 4th safety who gets promoted to the active roster for week 1 1 at the Chicago Bears. So there's the 49ers roster overall. I think it's a very, very solid, deep roster. A lot of talent top to bottom. You not only have great depth, but you have star players. And that was highlighted with the fact, too, that the 49ers had 7 guys in the NFL top 100, and arguably could have had a couple more as well. But I'm going to leave it there, guys. Those are my thoughts on the 49ers 53-man roster. I will be doing a live stream with John J from 49ers Ultimate Report. We do our San Francisco Candlestick Report. That's going to be tomorrow, Thursday, September 1st at 1 p.m. Join us for that. It's going to be a whole lot of fun. Thank you to everyone who watches the videos, who likes, subscribes. Really does mean a lot to me. I love doing this 49er content, and I like that you guys watching it too. So means a lot, and do subscribe if you enjoy what I do. Beyond that, though, I'm going to say 2 things. The butt counts, and I'm going to catch y'all on the flip side.